will bring up Texas. Clayton Wolf will be presenting the program here. Just to bring everybody up to speed, if you don't know Clayton, he received his Bachelor of Science in Forest Wildlife Management from Stephen F. Austin and his Master's of Ag from Texas A&M. He worked as a wildlife biologist for the Temple Inland Forest Projects Corporation in Newton County for 5 years before accepting the position as Piney Woods District Leader for TPWD in 1993. In 2001, he accepted the position as a white-tailed deer program leader, and in 2003 was promoted to the position of Big Game Program Director for the agency. In 2009, he accepted the Wildlife Division Director for Texas Parks Wildlife Department, and in 2015, he was asked to work with the Texas Parks Wildlife and TAHC in order to develop the current suite of CWD regulations. He also serves as the point of contact on all legislative matters associated with deer management. Welcome, Clayton, up.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. You know, when the organizers, Nathan and folks, asked if I could do a presentation on CWD management in Texas, I said, of course I can. And he said, in 30 minutes. I said, that's impossible. And so I had to really think about what I wanted to cover here. And so the topics I'm going to cover, some of it for our Texas crew here, there's just some basic statistics that I know that many of our folks here haven't seen. I want to make sure I don't gloss over those. Folks often ask, you know, where is it? Where have we found it in Texas? What are we doing? So I'll cover some of those stats through a timeline. But I also want to I'll talk a little bit about just some foundational principles that we use in our regulations development and our management strategies. Not going to get into the detail on all the regulations development. I'm not sure I could recite all those details, but I really want to try to convey just some of those foundational principles that we're using that we benchmark against when we're considering our management strategies. And then hopefully talk just a little bit about maybe some challenges that are unique to Texas or somewhat unique to Texas, and maybe some strategies that we have implemented that we feel are effective here. Next slide, please. So when I give any CWD presentation, the first thing I do is talk about our goals within our CWD management plan. We've had a CWD management plan for many years now. It's been revised a few times. It's obvious that our first goal is to minimize the risks to our free-ranging and captive CWD susceptible species in Texas. But the second one, and it's a topic that many have talked on, is really being able to establish and maintain support for our regulations and for our management strategies through adequate hunter, landowner, stakeholder outreach. And so I'm going to focus some on that. I know our other presenters have focused on that. It's very important to us, and so I'll go into that with some level of detail. But ultimately, it's all of this is to minimize those direct and indirect impacts of CWD to hunting-related economies and conservation in Texas. Yeah, I think Brian Richards mentioned it earlier. The studies that we have show that there's maybe a little more than $2 billion economic impact from hunting in Texas. It's important. It's very important, and that's why we invest our time. Slide. And one more. So other folks mentioned this. You know, the catalyst for some of our CWD activities in Texas was the discovery of CWD in Wisconsin in 2002. And so our two agencies, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and Texas Animal Health Commission, in March of 2002, took some actions to prohibit the entry of CWD susceptible species into the state. That's because we had data that showed animals were coming from being transported from Wisconsin specifically and other areas, and the risk was in front of us, and felt there was an urgent need to close the border until we could implement some reasonable measures to ensure this and safeguard these species. Next. So in the fall of 2002, we worked with Texas Animal Health Commission on you'll hear me reference our CWD task force. It's a dual agency task force between Texas Animal Health Commission and Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to work on entry requirements for the species that we regulate, for the species that Animal Health Commission regulates. And once those were developed, the complete prohibitions were rescinded, and they were replaced with these entry requirements. Next. So in November of 2002, just like many other states, we also began CWD surveillance in Texas. And so we trained our staff on collecting samples, and we had a sampling strategy that was statewide. It was parsed out by ecoregion, and folks began collecting samples on hunter-harvested deer. Next. In 2005, at the request of some of our stakeholders, and ultimately that turned into a recommendation from staff, we went to the commission with a proposal to close the borders to the importation of white-tailed deer and mule deer in Texas, and so that importation ban is in place today. Next. In that span between 2005 and 2006, again, we got our CWD task force together. And we recognized, and if you haven't heard it already, you know, we're pretty unique in Texas. Brian mentioned it. We allow for a lot of different management activities, including the movement of live deer. And I'm not talking just about captive cervids. We allow for the movement of free-ranging cervids out there, free-ranging white-tailed deer and mule deer under a permit from the agency. And our task force recognized the threat and the added risk that came with moving live animals, irrespective of whether that was a free-ranging animal or a captive animal. And so we worked on regulations to enhance the sampling at those source sites, whether they were a breeding facility or a trap site. Next. In July of 2012, we got our first positive free-ranging mule deer in the Hueco Mountains. And next slide, please. Unlike other states, I guess we were able to brace for this. We knew that CWD existed north of our border with New Mexico. That horizontal line there, if you're geographically challenged, is the border between Texas and New Mexico. And we knew that there were CWD positives 25, 30 miles north of us. It was in the winter of 2012 that New Mexico Game and Fish Department contacted our staff, let us know that of 4 deer that were sampled just north of the state line, 3 of them were CWD positive. So we were pretty certain if we didn't have CWD right then and there that we probably were going to be detected or have it soon. And so in that summer, as we were preparing, we did some target surveillance in that part of the state. I can't recall the number of deer. A few dozen deer were collected in those 4 areas. Next, and they're right there on the county line between El Paso County and Hudspeth County. We in fact did detect CWD. So that was our first CWD detection in 2012. Next. And so what I want to do is talk about the approach. You know, whether it was out in this part of the world or other places, basically our regulation strategy was a tiered strategy. We're a big state. We didn't think it was right to impose the same regulations across the state when we had CWD detected in these certain locales. So we used a tiered strategy with zones. That has modified some. We had 3 zones back then. We're now in a 2-zone structure. But essentially what we were looking at is having the most stringent regulations on live deer movement, ultimately on carcass deer movement, and mandatory testing in that first zone, and then getting less stringent as you moved away from that zone. Next. So then it was 3 years later. We're testing for 3 years and looking hard out west, as hard as we could with the low deer numbers, but it was on July of 2015 that we announced the first positive in a captive white-tailed deer facility in Medina County. Next. And so this shows you here, I think Brian showed this slide here, it's just west of San Antonio, and in the northwest corner of Medina County is where this facility was detected. Next slide, please. Then with some work with Texas Animal Health Commission and the records we had, and I'll talk about those records later, we knew that the 2-year-old cohort of animals from which these positives came, there were also some same animals that had gone to a breeding facility in Lavaca County. Next, please. And so sampling was done in that particular facility, and in fact, we did find CWD. Since that time, that facility has been depopulated, and we believe that in this particular case that we feel fairly confident that we were successful in containing the disease because those animals had not been on the ground very long in that particular area, and animals had not been released from that facility. So a little bit of good news, a little silver lining at least in that particular detection. Next. So in February, we discovered it in facility number 3, and you'll see me mention the detections in several more facilities This is because of the work that Texas Animal Health Commission was doing in conjunction with us, issuing hold orders. We were working cooperatively on herd plans that increased the sampling in these facilities, and it was, in fact, that increased sampling in these facilities that allowed us to detect CWD in some of these other captive facilities. So that's just in the western part of that zone, it's where that next facility was discovered. Next slide, please. In February of 2016, we found the first positive free-ranging mule deer in the Panhandle. Next. And so up in Hartley County. And so the same thing happened. Our commission implemented this zone structure with more stringent regulations related to live animal movement. The interesting thing about, and well, I'll talk about this a little bit later. Next slide. April 1st, 2016, facility number 4. Next. December 12th, we had the first positive free-ranging elk in the Panhandle. Next. Then January 24th, the first free-ranging white-tailed deer positive in Medina County. I'll stop here and talk a little bit about this one. I'll show you a map later. We probably have collected on the order of 2,000 samples in that zone in Medina County, which is maybe 25 miles by 20 miles. The bulk of our CWD positives are in that zone, but all but one of those are in captive deer breeding facilities or associated release sites. So with all those samples outside that facility, we contracted with Cesar Clayburgh Wildlife Research Institute to do some genetic work on that one white-tailed deer that was outside that facility. We had samples from the captive facilities in the area. We had samples from our free-ranging deer in that area. And the result of that study was basically told us that the parents, the sire and dam of this particular yearling buck, very probably came from a captive facility. We're not necessarily assigning that to any one facility, but it was much more closely related to those captive deer. How the animal got there, we don't know, but maybe that explains why, as we continue to look diligently, we have yet to find, let's keep our fingers crossed, another free-ranging white-tailed deer in that zone. On May 9th, 2017, facility number 5 in Medina County, and I will say that this, if I'm not mistaken, Mitch, was one that was detected with our ante-mortem testing protocol. And then December 29th, 2017, the first positive free-ranging white-tailed deer in the Panhandle. So we had mule deer first, elk second, and then we found free-ranging whitetail. This happened to be a roadkill. Next. So whether it's the Hueco Mountains out there, next slide, or it's Medina County, those are two different areas of the state with much different conditions. Very sparsely populated mule deer population in the Hueco Mountains, and extremely sparse in those flats in between the mountain range. High deer densities in Medina County. A lot of intensive deer management. Next slide. Irrespective of that, we have CWD management strategies, or the foundational principles that apply to all of these areas. First one is early detection. You've heard it before. You heard it from Jason, who was just up here. If we're going to be effective as we can be, and make sure we try to avert environmental contamination and spread that gets beyond something we can manage, we need to discover the disease as early as possible. And as you also saw, early detection means you got to sample intensively. This disease is difficult to find. It's very difficult to find when it's in very low prevalences, and so it's a continuing theme. When folks ask us, why did you adopt this regulation? Why are you doing this in a herd plan? Ultimately, when you look at it, when it's talking about getting more samples, it's because of early detection and then also helping us establish the prevalence and distribution of the disease. The other foundational strategy is containment. We understand that there are challenges with containing the disease, particularly in a free-ranging situation, but we also know there's some things we can do to contain the disease, and ultimately that is not inadvertently ship, whether they're captive deer or they're free-ranging deer, not inadvertently ship a CWD positive animal from one place to the other. And then also when we're talking about carcass movement restrictions and those most infectious carcass parts, there are some things we can do to contain the disease. Next slide. So whether it's out there in the Hueco Mountains, you know, when we discovered CWD in the Hueco Mountains, folks may not know this, but our commission adopted regulations related to triple T permits, to trapping permits. They adopted regulations related to deer breeding facilities. But the fact of the matter is, we didn't have anybody engaged in those facilities out there. We didn't have any trace outs. And so no one was impacted, at least in that containment zone. When you, next slide please, when you look at the deer management practices that we do permit and allow in Texas, and next slide please, many of those are being used or were being used in Medina County. So in fact, the same philosophy that we brought forward, in fact, did impact more people out there because more people were engaged in these deer management activities. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that is maybe rather unique here in Texas, and that's our record keeping for captive cervids. Next slide, please. We have quite a few captive deer breeders in Texas. And next slide, please. And I was visiting with Brian. Brian was here overseeing this program, you know, in the 90s, in the early 90s, and we're trying to refresh my memory. But 1996 and prior, really, folks were just submitting their records on paper. And we had, I don't know, 100, 150 deer breeders during those early stages when Brian was involved. Next. In 1997, though, Brian recognized that if we were going to be able to appropriately keep up with deer movements, that we needed to utilize strategies to try to electronically keep up with these deer movements. And so Brian wrote the code on a program that would electronically log these deer movements at the facility level. And of course, the paper form still had all the unique numbers of every one of those animals. Next slide. In 2006, what we were thinking about is, particularly as we were sampling for CWD, we felt like with the growth in the captive deer industry in Texas, more deer breeders, many more records, we needed to continue to use technology, and so we developed or improved that database not only to track those movements at the facility level, but by each individual animal, so that you could go in there and see where each individual animal had been through its lifetime. Next slide. To 2010, because the volume was growing, we developed an outward-facing portal so that permittees could enter their own data and do self-serve and weren't relying upon us getting the data in because the volumes were growing. And we tested that application. We worked to improve that application. We also provided Texas Animal Health Commission access to that application for use in their herd certification program. And by 2013, we made it mandatory that permitted individuals would do all the data entry because of the user-friendliness of this, with our staff providing the support on the back end. So with this particular database we had a lot of records. We had a lot of records in there. Next slide. So what did that mean on that first discovery of that Medina County facility number 1? Next. Well, what we learned was just within a couple of days, once Texas Animal Health Commission veterinarians gave us the parameters for what an exposed facility would be, because they needed to have that in order to impose the hold orders and quarantines, etc. Once we had those parameters, within just a couple of days, if not a day, we knew there were 30 deer breeding facilities that had contributed deer to this index facility in the last 5 years. Next. We knew that there were many facilities, 96 deer breeding facilities and 46 release sites and other sites up there that had received deer from this index facility in the last 5 years. Next, a total of 177 facilities. Next, 835 deer. That's a lot. That's a lot of information that we were able to produce on short order because of the foresight of some of our predecessors in recognizing that this database would be necessary to helping us help Texas Animal Health Commission in their epidemiological investigation. Next. Here's what it looks like on the landscape. By the way, that was the trace-in facilities. So you can see it's most of Texas. Next slide. Trace-out facility. Those are all the facilities that were receiving deer, maybe with the exception of the two areas in Mexico. Next slide. And so this is where I want to focus on our partnership with Texas Animal Health Commission. I realize, and as I've listened to my peers in other states, that the relationship between the state wildlife agency and the state agency, sometimes it's the Department of Ag. Here in Texas, it's the Animal Health Commission, but that agency that oversees the herd certification program and animal health programs, we have a very strong and positive relationship. Some might say it's out of necessity, but in fact, we've had that relationship for a long time before. And Andy, I want to say, the support that your staff showed us, I know it's a two-way street and we were providing the data, but it was truly a team effort. Next slide. We worked with Animal Health Commission before CWD. We were doing bovine tuberculosis monitoring, but when we started CWD monitoring, we formed our CWD task force. We were side by side with Texas Animal Health Commission in rural development. We were when we discovered CWD in the captive deer breeding facilities, whether it's rural development of herd plans, whatever it was. Our team members were getting together weekly, sometimes if not daily, putting in a lot of hours. And I just want to say, probably, in other states, it's going to depend on the regulatory oversight and what regulatory oversight your agencies have, if you even have captive deer breeding. But in Texas, just to let you know, TPWD has authority over white-tailed deer and mule deer. Texas Animal Health Commission is the agency with oversight over a herd certification program for captive cervids. And then there's also some overlap when it comes to diseases that can be found in wildlife that impact livestock. So clearly there's overlap, and clearly there's a need for the teams to work together. And I could say without a doubt that Texas Animal Health Commission and Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and our staff worked hand in hand on this project, and it was in fact synergistic. Next. I want to talk about another partner. I think Dr. Tomachek had to leave this afternoon. He'll be back tomorrow, but that's our partnership with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. But it's also it's a three-way partnership, and so one of the things that we recognized was, if we were going to detect the disease early, and it's with such a big state, we needed to get a lot of samples out there. I have come to learn from Texas Animal Health Commission staff, at least they believe, that Texas is one of 3 states that utilizes people other than veterinarians and agency staff to collect CWD samples. So Texas Animal Health Commission oversees this collector certification training, and that's so that we can get out there and get more samples. Texas A&M AgriLife was a partner on that along with us in conducting these trainings, and I'll tell you that advanced probably 2 clicks. That as a result, and I got these data from Texas Animal Health Commission to date, there's been close to 1,800 individuals that have been certified for postmortem sample collection, and you'll see only 108 of those are veterinarians. My guess is probably a few hundred agency staff. So the vast majority of those that are certified are not agency staff, they're not veterinarians. But as you can see, that's a heck of a multiplier in the workforce when we're trying to get out there and get as many samples as possible. Also 184 veterinarians trained in antemortem sample collection, and I'm told that's probably on the order of 10 to 12 of the major classes. That also includes the 2 classes taught by Dr. Walt Cook there at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Texas A&M University. Next. AgriLife Extension also works, obviously, their expertise communicating with folks and getting the word out there, and so in the development of publications, not just in English, but also in Spanish. Next. And then we worked, Dr. Dittmar worked with Dr. Chomachek and AgriLife to develop some really high-quality videos. So y'all didn't know you had movie stars in amongst you, but some high-quality videos on sample collection. And now these are not on our agency website right now. They take up a lot of bandwidth, but I was able to pull them up. And you talk about some really great quality video that shows you, how to get to those retropharyngeal lymph nodes and how to orient yourself. And so Dr. Tomachek had told me, anybody that needs this, for refresher training for your agency staff, to make sure that they're properly collecting samples. Just let us know, let Dr. Dittmar, Dr. Tomacek know, and we'll be glad to get those videos in your hand. But as you might expect, those 1,800 certified collectors, video out there, Dr. Akey mentioned this, that means we're collecting a lot of samples. We went from a few thousand samples, 2 to 3 a year in the early 2000s, maybe got to 4,000 or 5,000 in the era of 2012. In the last 3 years, 30, 34,000 samples, depending on where you're looking. And so that's a huge difference in workload for our diagnostic lab. So I do have to, again, mention, next slide, our other partner, important partner in this, and that's the Texas A&M Veterinary Medical Diagnostic Lab. And the diagnostic lab has had representation on our CWD task force for many, many years. And so whenever we're contemplating regulation changes, sampling changes, we always work with Dr. Akey and his crew to try to make sure that they have the capacity, that they are giving us the information they need, so that we don't create unnecessary bottlenecks. And I'll get into this in a second, but there's another partner in this, and this partner has been very important, and that's USDA APHIS. And whether that's us working on ante-mortem sample collection and making sure that we keep the diagnostic lab in good standing, or whether we're talking about the interface between our databases to try to improve the efficiency of the data as we move it back and forth. There have been a lot of collaborations that have really helped improve our efficiency. The diagnostic lab and USDA, whether we're talking about the lab or we're talking about depopulation events out there, these partnerships, what we have gotten done, we couldn't have gotten done without these partners. Next slide. And so in this room, almost 3 years ago, we had our CWD Ante-Mortem Testing Symposium, and the purpose of this particular slide is just to show you or to remind myself next, that it wasn't just agency folks. We engaged many stakeholders in this process, and we believe that we know over 95% of Texas is privately owned. Private landowners are very important partners, as well as hunters, land managers, outfitters, obviously all of our agency folks. And so the stakeholder process we went through for rule development from 2015 to 2016, in my 25 years with the agency, is the most intensive outreach process that I've ever been involved in. In fact, that any of my colleagues have ever been involved in. I'll tell you, and the reason is because it's that important. You've heard it before. It's that important that we get this right, or we do this the job as well as we can. Before I put my closing slides up, I know there's a couple other details that I just want to show folks since I do have a little bit of time. Next slide. Folks are always asking, so how many positives do we have in Texas? So this particular table shows you there. There's 133 total. That's one was added here just a couple of days ago. Same old facilities, no new locations, folks, so no need for a news release. But of those 133, over 100 of them are from deer breeding release sites and those associated deer breeding facilities and associated release sites. I'll show you next slide. Just geographically, it's what it looks like. This slide is dated by one deer, so most of them are there in the Hueco Mountains. This summer, though, we did have one CWD positive in the Franklin Mountains there north of El Paso. So still out there in the western part of the world, very sparsely populated. If we'll advance one more slide, this is the Panhandle, and I will tell you all these blue symbols are not detected. So we've got these neat little tablets and devices now where our folks can collect the locations and get the locations from the hunters and actually geo-reference them. So these are mule deer, the light green. That's elk. These are the two whitetail. These are check station symbols. And so you can see some of the stats there. This is up to date. It includes there are 8 deer up in that part of the world right now, and it just shows a little bit of sampling history of what we've done the last several years. And then this is the zone there in Medina, Uvalde, and Bandera County there, and this is obviously we have a much higher deer population. We're getting a lot more samples. All of these are captive facilities here. This is the spot of the one free-ranging whitetail. And so they're all those captive facilities that are still open, or even if they're closed, have herd plans. And so they also are sampling within those plans under those specific custom-written plans to increase sampling in those sites if they have not been depopulated and closed. This slide is probably about 14 or 15 deer shy. We've gone through a few depopulation events in some of the pens in one of the facility and added a few more. So same facility that we've been working with, no new locations, just the sample size in a couple of those facilities has gone up. And so, closing thoughts. I thought, what really did I want folks to take away from this? I didn't want to get stuck in the details of regulations and things like that. I think this is the first thought is that CWD can have a negative impact on cervid populations. You've heard it several times today. We sometimes battle a myth that there's nothing to worry about here. I think that y'all have seen that there's enough information to know that this is a disease. Obviously, population dynamics of different herds, these herds react differently, but it definitely is a cause for concern. Number two, much is at stake. I mean, it's the reason we have so many folks in this room. I'm sure we could have put a lot more folks in this room. Deer hunting, the deer resource is extremely important to Texas. Obviously, it's the reason we're in this business is to protect that resource, whether that's captive, free-ranging, working with Texas Animal Health Commission on those exotic species that are all CWD susceptible. There's a lot at stake here, and so all that effort we have put into this is because it is important. Next, just don't forget early detection means we got to sample a lot. So, we need everyone's help. If we're adopting regulations or contemplating regulations to increase our sampling, it's because we want to detect this disease as early as possible. You've heard that theme mentioned several times. Next, containment is important. There's several ways to contain, whether we're talking about stopping live animal movement, or if we're talking about carcass movement restrictions. Obviously, when it's in the free-ranging population, we may be more challenged. So we're going to be working with our partners in the other states. We'll be interested, to see what happens with a change in some harvest strategies, whether it's in Missouri or whether it's in Wyoming. And we also are contemplating internally a long-term study in Texas to look at some of our CWD areas of free range and see if we can determine management practices that may be increasing transmission, or maybe even management practices that are not increasing transmission. And then finally, just a little timely, if the disease is found in a population that is moved, and it's not necessarily just a captive population, can also be these free-ranging populations. Texas, I think we're still going to be unique in our deer management. I don't think we're going to shut down deer movement totally. But if we're not going to do that, that means we have to be diligent in our sampling at the source sites, whether that's triple T sites or captive deer breeder sites. And we also have to have reliable identification and reliable records. So when those animals are moved, or if they are moved, and if there's a positive, we can quickly get information to work with Texas Animal Health Commission to make sure that we go to those exposed facilities, exposed areas quickly, and react quickly. And with that concludes my presentation. I think I'm out of time.